The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. as always. Emily Thompson opened her eyes reluctantly, observing the peeling ceiling of the small apartment in the outskirts of Chicago. There was another overdue electricity bill on the kitchen table, and rent would be due in 3 days. As usual, the money wouldn't be enough for everything. She sat up in bed and ran her hands over her face, pushing away the curly hair that fell over her brown eyes. At 35, the lines of expression were already beginning to mark her forehead, silent witnesses to years of worry. Through the thin wall, she could hear her children still sleeping. Matthew, 12, and Sophie, 8. "Lord, give me strength for another day," Emily whispered, a prayer that had become her daily mantra. She got up and walked to the bathroom, avoiding the loose floorboards that creaked. The mirror revealed deep, dark circles, the result of sleepless nights calculating and recalculating bills, trying to do the impossible math of stretching her administrative assistant salary to cover all needs. While heating water for coffee in the small kitchen, Emily looked at the worn Bible on the table. She picked it up, opening it randomly as she did every morning, seeking a message, a sign, anything that could renew her hope. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow and darkness." Emily closed the book with a sigh. That verse had been with her for years, since Frank, her ex-husband, had abandoned the family without explanation, leaving her with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. Since then, she had been living in this valley, waiting for a light that seemed never to come. The coffee overflowed, interrupting her thoughts. She quickly cleaned up and began preparing breakfast for the children. Rice from the day before and eggs. It had been weeks since she could buy fruits or yogurt that the children liked so much. "Mom, can I go on the school trip next week?" Sophie asked, already seated at the table, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "The teacher said we're going to the museum." Emily's heart tightened. The cost of the trip, $50, might seem little to many, but for her it meant choosing between the trip and part of the school supplies she still needed to buy. "We'll see, honey. Mommy will figure something out," she replied with a forced smile, serving the thin milk coffee to the girl. Matthew, already dressed for school, observed the scene in silence. At 12, he already fully understood the family's financial situation. "It's okay, Mom. I can help Sophie with the assignment the teacher will give about the museum," he said, exchanging a knowing look with his mother. Emily felt her chest tighten. Her son was growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities he shouldn't have at that age. "Thank you, son, but we'll figure something out." "You need these experiences," she replied, running her hand through the boy's hair. After dropping the children off at the local public school, Emily walked to the bus stop. She would have to take 2 crowded buses to get to the accounting firm, where she had worked for 5 years. The hour-and-a-half journey was her moment of prayer and reflection. On the bus, observing the awakening city through the foggy window, Emily tried to understand why her life seemed like an endless cycle of difficulties. She faithfully paid tithe to the church she had attended since childhood, even when it meant giving up basic necessities. She prayed without ceasing. She lived honestly. Why then did financial blessings seem so distant? Pastor Barbara, her spiritual mentor, always said that God provided in his perfect timing. But how much longer would it take? The children were growing up fast, and with them, the needs increased. Arriving at work, she was greeted by Mrs. Johnson, the 60-year-old receptionist who was practically a second mother to everyone in the office. "Good morning, dear. My, those dark circles are getting bigger." "Slept poorly again?" asked the lady, adjusting her colorful framed glasses. "The usual, Mrs. Johnson. Bills, worries," Emily replied with a tired smile. "I have a wonderful chamomile tea that will help you sleep, and also," Mrs. Johnson lowered her voice, looking around, "I heard that Mr. Oliver is looking for someone to work on Saturdays, organizing the dead files. Off the books payment." Emily's eyes lit up. Extra work could be the solution to this month's expenses. "Really? I'll talk to him today." The morning passed quickly between spreadsheets and phone calls. At lunchtime, instead of going to the cafeteria, Emily headed to Mr. Oliver's office, a 70-year-old gentleman who had founded the company decades ago and now ran it with an iron fist. "Excuse me, Mr. Oliver, can I talk to you for a minute?" The grey-haired man with reading glasses hanging on the tip of his nose gestured for her to enter. Mrs. Johnson told me about the Saturday work in the archives. Ah, yes, he interrupted her, taking off his glasses. We need to organize that mess. 5 years of piled-up documents. I'd pay $200 per Saturday, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Interested? Emily quickly did the mental calculations. It would be an extra $800 a month. With that money, she could catch up on bills and even save a little for emergencies. Definitely, sir. When can I start? This Saturday. He evaluated her for a few moments. You're a good employee, Emily. Punctual, efficient, but you always seem worried. Problems at home? The question caught Emily by surprise. In 5 years, this was the most personal conversation she had ever had with her boss. Just the challenges of raising 2 children alone, she replied, preferring not to go into details. Mr. Oliver nodded. I understand. My mother also raised 3 children alone after my father left us. She was a cleaning lady, worked in 3 houses a day. He paused, looking out the window. Life isn't easy for those who are alone, but God doesn't give us a burden we can't carry. Emily almost laughed. How many times had she heard that phrase? From the pastor, from church friends, from well-meaning people who had no idea of the weight she carried daily. Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. Back at her desk, Emily felt a twinge in the right side of her abdomen. She ignored the pain, as she had been doing for the past few days. She didn't have time to be sick, couldn't afford that luxury. At night, after picking up the children from the neighbor who looked after them after school, Emily prepared a simple dinner and helped with homework. The pain in her abdomen had increased, but she disguised it, not wanting to worry the children. When she finally managed to put them to bed, she allowed herself a moment of weakness. Sitting on the edge of the bed, doubled over in pain, she let the tears flow silently. Why, Lord? She murmured, looking at the small crucifix on the wall. Where are you in the midst of all this struggle? At that moment, the phone rang. It was Pastor Barbara. Honey, I'm sorry to call so late, but I felt in my spirit that I needed to talk to you. Is everything okay? The welcoming voice of the pastor, a 65-year-old African-American woman who had become her family when everyone else had distanced themselves, broke Emily's last defenses. Between sobs, she told about the financial difficulties, the extra work on Saturdays, and finally, about the pain she had been feeling for days. Emily, you need to go to the doctor. Right now. I'm going to ask Deacon Paul to pick you up and take you to the emergency room. I can't, Pastor. The children are sleeping and I have no one to leave them with. I'll stay with them myself. I'm leaving now for your house and Paul is on his way to take you to the hospital. It's not negotiable, honey. The Holy Spirit is alerting me. 15 minutes later, Deacon Paul, a strong, middle-aged man who worked as a security guard, parked his car in front of Emily's building. The pastor had already arrived and was with the children. Let's go, sister. Trust in God, said Paul, helping Emily into the car. On the way to County General Hospital, the pain became almost unbearable. A thin layer of sweat covered Emily's forehead, and she was starting to feel feverish. In the crowded emergency room, a young doctor examined Emily quickly and frowned. We need an urgent blood test and CT scan. I suspect appendicitis. The test. Results confirmed the doctor's suspicion. Advanced stage appendicitis about to rupture. Emily was immediately prepared for surgery. We need to operate now, explained Dr. Victoria, a woman with Native American features and a firm gaze. The situation is serious, but you came in just in time. As the medical team prepared her for the operation, Emily thought about her children. Who would take care of them if something happened to her? Their father, Frank, had disappeared years ago, leaving no address or phone number. Her parents, both elderly, lived in rural Indiana and could barely take care of themselves. Can I make a call before? She asked, her voice trembling. The nurse nodded, handing her the cell phone. Emily called Pastor Barbara. Pastor, I'm going into surgery now. If something happens to me... Stop that, girl, interrupted the pastor firmly. You're going to come out of this surgery healed, and in Jesus' name you'll return to your children. We're all praying for you. The entire church is in vigil." The pastor's words calmed her heart a bit. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. When the anesthesia began to take effect, her last vision was of the white ceiling of the operating room and the bright lights that seemed to envelop her in a warm embrace. Then everything went dark. The first sign that something was wrong came from the monitors. The constant beep turned into a continuous, alarming tone. "Cardiac arrest!" shouted the anesthesiologist. "Start resuscitation protocol." The medical team moved with precision and urgency around the operating table, while Dr. Raphael, the chief surgeon, continued the procedure to contain the infection from the ruptured appendix. Dr. Victoria commanded the resuscitation maneuvers. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted, rhythmically pressing Emily's chest. "Prepare an ampule of adrenaline." But Emily was no longer there, not completely. She hovered above her own body, observing with strange serenity the frenzied movement of the doctors. She could clearly see her inert body on the table, the pale face partially covered by the oxygen mask, the team working feverishly to bring her back. Am I leaving?" she thought without fear, just with a hint of sadness for the children she would leave behind. That's when she realized she wasn't alone in that strange plane between worlds. A luminous presence was forming beside her, growing more and more intense until she could no longer look directly at it. "My daughter," said a voice that reverberated not in her ears, but throughout her entire being. "Come with me. There's something you need to understand." Emily felt enveloped by that light, transported beyond the operating room, beyond the hospital, beyond the physical world she knew. The sensation was one of absolute peace, an unconditional love that enveloped her like she had never felt before. When she was able to focus again, she was before him. She needed no introductions or explanations. Every fiber of her being recognized who that presence was. Jesus Christ, not as images portrayed him, but infinitely more real and majestic, looked at her with a love that transcended any human understanding. His eyes. Emily could never adequately describe that gaze. It was as if the entire history of the universe was there, along with an intimate knowledge of every moment of her life. There was no judgment, only infinite compassion. "Why, Lord?" was all Emily could ask, knowing he would understand the full meaning of that simple question. Jesus smiled, a smile that seemed to illuminate all of existence. "Come," he said, extending his hand. "There's something you need to see." Emily felt transported again. Images began to form around her, like a three-dimensional screen that showed her own life, but with details she could never have seen from her earthly perspective. She saw herself, small at just 6 years old, listening to her parents argue about money. Her father, a hard-working man but constantly in debt. Her mother, always anxious when opening bills at the end of the month. Generations of her family living in the same cycle of scarcity and poor financial management. "You're not just fighting for yourself," Jesus explained, his voice echoing through the images. "You're breaking chains that have bound your family for generations." The scene changed. Now Emily saw a spiritual panorama she never imagined existed. Spiritual beings, some luminous and others shadowy, moving around people on earth. She clearly saw how negative forces worked specifically to prevent the financial progress of the faithful. "The adversary knows well the power of a chosen one. With resources," Jesus continued. "He knows that when my children prosper, my kingdom advances on earth. That's why finances are one of the main fields of spiritual battle." Emily watched, fascinated and horrified, as these forces operated subtly, creating from small setbacks to major financial obstacles in believers' lives. "But why do you allow this?" she asked, confused. Jesus led her to another scenario. This time, Emily saw alternative versions of people she recognized from her church. In one of these versions, Mr. George, a faithful deacon who always struggled financially, appeared prosperous and rich, but also distant from God, absorbed in material pleasures, his family falling apart. due to money that came before he was prepared to manage it. Often, the apparent lack of response is, in fact, my greatest protection, Jesus explained. It's not punishment, it's preparation. The images continued to change, showing people who received financial blessings at the exact time when they were spiritually prepared for the responsibility that comes with prosperity. Emily saw how these people transformed lives and entire communities through the resources they received. The perfect time, she murmured, beginning to understand. Yes, Jesus confirmed. Each blessing has its exact moment in my plan. Then Jesus showed Emily something that left her breathless. The Israelites in the desert, receiving manna daily, needing to trust God every morning for their sustenance. Many of my children desire immediate abundance, he said, but they haven't yet learned to depend on me daily for their needs. The desert is a school, not punishment. Emily felt each word penetrating deeply into her spirit, transforming her understanding of the struggles she faced. And what about me, Lord? She finally asked. What's the purpose in my financial difficulties? Jesus smiled again, this time directing all attention to her. He showed her images of herself in moments of financial despair, but also in moments when, even with nothing, she helped someone in greater need. He showed how her faith, although tested, grew stronger with each trial. You're being prepared, Emily, he said with infinite tenderness, not just to receive, but to manage, not just to be blessed, but to be a channel of blessings. The images changed one more time, showing scenes of the future that left Emily amazed. She saw herself leading a financial counseling ministry, helping families break cycles of poverty, using her own story as testimony to God's transforming power. This is just a glimpse of what I've prepared for you, Jesus said. But there's work to be done before this is realized. Are you willing to trust me even without seeing the complete picture? Before Emily could answer, she felt herself being pulled back. The images dissolved, the luminous presence of Jesus began to distance itself. Your time hasn't come yet, my daughter, he said, his voice already seeming more distant. Go back and share what you've seen. But Lord, Emily cried out, feeling separated from him. I still have so many questions. Trust in my perfect timing was the last thing she heard before everything went dark again. In the operating room, after 9 minutes and 12 seconds of incessant efforts, the heart monitor began to register beats again. We have a pulse, exclaimed Dr. Victoria, the relief evident in her voice. Stabilize her. The surgery proceeded without further complications. The appendix was removed, the infection contained, and Emily was transferred to the ICU for post-operative recovery. Hours later, when she woke up in the ICU, the first thing she saw was Pastor Barbara's worried face beside her bed. Welcome back, child, said the pastor, holding her hand. You gave us quite a scare. Emily tried to speak, but her throat was dry due to the tube that had been removed. The pastor offered her a little water with a spoon. The doctors said you were technically dead for over 9 minutes, the pastor continued, her eyes watery. It was a miracle, Emily. There's no other explanation. Emily nodded weakly, trying to organize the memories of what she had experienced. It seemed so real, so vivid, not like a dream or hallucination. I saw him, Pastor, she whispered. With difficulty. I saw Jesus. The pastor squeezed her hand tighter. Tell me everything, child. What did you see? With a weak voice, Emily began to relate the transcendental experience she had lived. The pastor listened attentively, silent tears running down her wrinkled face. He showed me why we go through financial difficulties, Emily explained. It's not punishment, Pastor. It's protection. It's preparation for something greater. The pastor nodded, wiping away her tears. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. She quoted Isaiah 55:8. Exactly, Emily agreed. He showed me that my financial struggles have a greater purpose than I could have imagined. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and the doctor entered to check on her condition. Emily saved the rest of the story for later, but something had changed within her. The same woman who had entered the hospital carrying the weight of financial worries now felt an inexplicable peace, even knowing that her bills would still be waiting for her when she was discharged. Later, when the doctor left, the pastor stroked Emily's hair. "Your children are fine. They're with Sister Nancy from the church. They want to see you so badly, but the doctor said they can only come tomorrow, when you're transferred to the regular room." 3 days later, Emily was discharged from the hospital. The surgery had been a success, and the doctors were surprised by her rapid recovery. "A case for the medical books," Dr. Robert commented during the final visit. Pastor Betty and Deacon. Paul took her home, where Matthew and Sophie waited anxiously, along with several women from the church who had taken turns caring for the children and preparing the house for her arrival. "Mommy!" Sophie shouted, running to hug her as soon as she entered the apartment. "Careful, sweetie. Mommy is still recovering," the pastor warned, helping Emily sit on the worn sofa in the small living room. Matthew approached more cautiously, his eyes revealing the fear he had felt. "Are you going to be okay now, Mom?" he asked in a low voice, sitting next to her. "I will, my love," Emily replied, caressing her son's face. "In fact, I don't think I've ever been better." It was true. Despite the physical pain from the surgery and the worry about the bills that still needed to be paid, now added to the hospital expenses, Emily felt an inner peace she hadn't experienced in years. The experience she had lived during those 9 minutes had completely transformed her perspective. The women from the church had organized a schedule to help her during her recovery. They brought food every day, helped with household chores, and took turns taking the children to and from school. The community's solidarity was a living testimony to the love Jesus had shown her. 2 weeks after the surgery, still recovering, Emily received an unexpected visit. Mr. Oliver, her boss, appeared at her apartment late on a Sunday afternoon, looking out of place in his impeccable suit in that simple environment. "I hope I'm not disturbing," he said, sitting in the chair Emily offered. "I came to see how you're doing and to bring this." He extended an envelope. Inside, Emily found her full month's salary, even though she had missed 2 weeks, plus a considerable bonus. "But I didn't work the whole month," she protested, confused. "Consider it an advance on your Christmas bonus," he replied with a dismissive gesture. "And the bonus is for all your dedicated work over these years. I should have done this before." Emily felt her eyes water. That money would take care of the overdue bills, and there would even be some left over. "Thank you, Mr. Oliver. I don't know how to thank you." The man cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the emotion. "There's one more thing," he continued, adjusting his glasses. "We're expanding the company, opening a branch in Seaside. We need someone trustworthy to supervise the financial department there. The salary would be double your current one, with a family health plan and housing allowance." Emily was speechless. It was an opportunity she never expected to receive. I don't have a finance degree," was all she could say. "But you have integrity and common sense, which are rarer than diplomas." Mr. Oliver stood up. "Think about it. When you're recovered, we can talk more. The branch will only open in 2 months. After he left, Emily remained seated, the envelope with the money in her hands, remembering Jesus' words. "Every financial blessing comes at exactly the right time." Could this be the answer to her prayers? The end of the financial difficulties that had tormented her for so long? The next night, during the Bible study at her house, which the pastor had insisted on maintaining, even with Emily recovering, she shared the news with the small group. "God is opening doors, sister," exclaimed Mrs. Zoe, a 75-year-old lady who was the church's most dedicated intercessor. "But Seaside is far," Emily observed. "It would mean taking the kids out of school, away from their friends, from the church. Sometimes we need to leave." "The familiar to embrace our purpose," said Pastor Betty, looking at her significantly. "Like Abraham, who left without knowing where he was going, just trusting in the promise." After the study, when everyone had left, the pastor stayed to talk with Emily alone. "You haven't told everything about your experience, have you?" The pastor asked, sitting next to her. "I feel there's more." Emily nodded. There were details of the vision that she hadn't shared with anyone, not even the pastor. He showed me a future, a financial counseling ministry. I was helping people break cycles of poverty, using my own story as a testimony. The pastor smiled as if she already knew this. Last month, before your surgery, I asked God for direction for a new ministry. In the church, something aimed at families in financial difficulties. She held Emily's hands. I think now I know who should lead it. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. It was exactly what Jesus had shown her. But how, Pastor? If I accept the job in Seaside, I'll be far from the church. And even if I stay, I'll still be struggling with my own financial difficulties. How could I counsel others? Perhaps these are not mutually exclusive choices, but complementary ones, replied the pastor, with the wisdom of someone who had seen many divine plans unfold throughout life. Don't you see? The job in Seaside could be the training you need for the ministry. In the days that followed, Emily reflected a lot on the conversation with the pastor. Between prayers and Bible readings, she felt she was at a crossroads, but unlike what would have happened in the past, there was no fear or anxiety, just a serene curiosity about the path God had laid out for her. 4 weeks after the surgery, fully recovered, Emily returned to work. She was warmly welcomed by everyone, especially by Mrs. June, who hugged her crying. "Girl, when I heard your heart. Stopped on the operating table, I almost had a fit," exclaimed the receptionist, wiping away tears. "But look at you now, you even look younger. There's something different in your eyes." "The experience changes you, Mrs. June," Emily replied, with a serene smile. At the end of the workday, Mr. Oliver called her into his office. "Have you thought about the proposal, Emily?" "I have." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I'd like to accept, but I have one condition." Mr. Oliver raised his eyebrows, surprised. The Emily from before would never have dared to impose conditions. And what would that be? "I'd like to work 4 days a week in Seaside so I can return to the city on Fridays. There's a project at my church that's very important to me." The man studied her for a few moments before responding. "Seems fair. As long as the work gets done, I don't see any problems in flexing your days." He extended his hand to seal the deal. "Welcome to your new position, financial manager." 2 months later, Emily and her children moved into a comfortable apartment in Seaside near the beach. The children quickly adapted to the new school, and Emily took on her duties at the company branch with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. On Fridays, as agreed, she returned to the city to lead the newly created New Beginning ministry at Pastor Betty's church. What started as a small group of women sharing financial difficulties transformed into a structured program of financial education, career guidance, and spiritual support. Emily used not only the knowledge she acquired daily in her work, but mainly the revelations she had received during her near-death experience. She taught about generational curses affecting finances, spiritual warfare over resources, and the importance of trusting in God's perfect timing. "It's not about getting rich overnight," she explained to the growing group each week. "It's about breaking cycles of scarcity, wisely managing what God has already given us, and understanding that each financial phase has a greater purpose." In no time, the ministry became known throughout the region. Other churches began to invite Emily for lectures and workshops. Her personal story, the single mother who almost passed away, came back with a revelation and transformed her financial life, inspired multitudes. 1 year after the surgery, on a rainy Friday, Emily was conducting another ministry meeting when she noticed an unfamiliar man sitting in the last row. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't immediately identify what. At the end of the meeting, while talking with some participants, the man approached. When she could finally see him up close, Emily felt her legs weaken. Frank? There. Before her was her ex-husband, thinner with grey hair at the temples, his eyes carrying the weight of deep regrets. "How long have you been attending your meetings?" 3 weeks, he replied, his voice choked. "When I heard what happened to you, what you experienced, I needed to see for myself." "How did you know?" "I ran into Matthew by chance in downtown Seaside. He recognized Me, even after so many years. Frank paused, visibly struggling against emotion. Our son told me everything, about your illness, your experience, how your life changed. He said you teach people about finances now, that you're helping entire families. Emily didn't know what to say. For years she had imagined this moment, sometimes with anger, sometimes with sadness, but never like this, with this strange sensation that everything was part of a greater plan. "Why did you leave, Frank?" she finally asked, her voice calmer than she thought possible. He lowered his eyes, ashamed. "Fear, debts, a gambling addiction I couldn't control." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I believed you'd be better off without me. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Pastor Betty, who had been observing the scene from afar, approached discreetly. "Why don't you finish this conversation in my office?" she suggested, indicating the way. "I have fresh coffee there." In the small room at the back of the church, Emily listened to Frank's story, how he had fled to the northeast, working temporary jobs to escape creditors, how the gambling addiction had consumed him for years, until in a Gamblers Anonymous group in Recife, he found help and eventually faith. How he had spent the last 3 years trying to rebuild his life, paying off old debts, seeking stability. "I didn't come to ask to come back," he said finally. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to fix things. I wanted to ask for forgiveness and, if possible, get to know our children better." Emily felt silent tears running down her face. They weren't tears of hurt or anger, but of understanding. How many times during her experience had Jesus spoken about cycles that needed to be broken, about the perfect time for everything? "You have a long road ahead, Frank," she said, wiping away the tears. "Regaining the children's trust, showing that you've really changed. It won't be easy. I know, I'm willing to try at their pace." "At their pace," Emily repeated, remembering Jesus' words. In perfect timing. 6 months passed since Frank's reappearance. He had rented a small apartment in Seaside, close to the family, and slowly begun to rebuild his relationship with the children. Matthew, initially reserved, was starting to open up gradually, especially when his father showed genuine interest in his computer classes. Sophie, with the typical resilience of children, adapted more easily to her father's presence in their lives. Frank also began attending Emily's ministry, not just as a listener, but eventually sharing his own story of financial addictions and recovery. His perspective complemented Emily's work, bringing the male side of an issue that affected entire families. On a Saturday morning, as they walked along the beach with the children running ahead, Frank and Emily talked about the future of the ministry. "Have you ever thought about turning this into something bigger?" he asked. "Your impact could reach many more people if you expanded beyond the church." "Sometimes I dream about that," Emily admitted. "A Bible-based financial training center, online classes, teaching materials." "Why don't you do it? You have the knowledge, the personal experience, the motivation." Emily smiled, looking at the horizon where the sky met the sea. "Everything has its time, Frank. If I learned anything on that operating table, it was to trust in God's perfect timing." That night, after the children went to bed, Emily sat on the balcony of her apartment, contemplating the city lights and the sea in the distance. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. The financial difficulties that had tormented her so much in the past were now her testimony, her tool to help others. Frank was back, not as the husband who had left, but as a partner in raising the children and in the ministry. Her financial situation had stabilized, and more importantly, she had found her purpose, using her own journey to guide others through their financial deserts to their promised lands. As the gentle night winds caressed her face, Emily remembered the question Jesus had asked her. During her experience, "Are you willing to trust me even without seeing the whole picture?" Now, seeing how the pieces fit together perfectly, she smiled. The answer was an unequivocal yes. 2 years after the surgery that almost took her, Emily published her first book, 9 minutes and 12 seconds, What Jesus Taught Me About Finances While I Was on the Other Side. The book quickly became a bestseller in Christian literature, opening doors for lectures throughout Brazil. The New Beginning ministry expanded to dozens of churches, with training for local leaders. To implement the program, Frank, now graduated in accounting, became the administrative director of the project, ensuring that Emily's vision could reach as many people as possible. And in each testimony, in each lecture, in each encounter with people struggling with financial difficulties, Emily shared the same message. Your financial struggles are not punishment, they are preparation. They are not delay, they are divine strategy. And when you understand this, you'll see that each moment of scarcity was preparing you for a purpose greater than you could ever imagine. Dear listeners, we hope that Emily's story has deeply touched your hearts and perhaps transformed your perspective on financial struggles. To continue this journey of reflection and growth, we've prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories that will reveal other aspects of divine wisdom. Find it by clicking on the link to the left. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Daily, we bring unique content that explores the complexities of life from a perspective of faith and hope. Share in the comments your own experience with financial challenges and how your faith helped you overcome them. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to hear today.